We model, you talk, no big whoop. Wait, what? Never mind.
Wait, what? Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk.
I'm Nate Silver.
And this is Model Talk. That was a little delayed. Are you distracted by the governor's model?
It's been a lot of work. We have 3 models, House, Senate governors. They were all kind of rebuilt or built from scratch. We hadn't had a House and a governor's forecast since 2010. Did a lot of work on the Senate forecast. So it's been a ton. Can we say that on the podcast?
Well, yeah, but we should also say what the headline is, that the governor's model is out. Now all of 538's 2018...
By the time you're listening to this, the governor's model is being published in 7 minutes from now. Not from your now as a listener, but from our now. Someone will hit a button, and you'll now be able to see gubernatorial forecasts in all 36, I think it is, states with a governor's race.
And that's what we're going to talk about today. When I talked to you before, Nate, about the governor's races, you did not seem particularly interested in them. Has your opinion changed at all now that you've gone through the process of actually creating a model?
Yeah, I mean, my interest, for a while was like, before we had the Senate model out, I was like, why are people wasting their time on these Senate polls, right? The House is so much more interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Then I was like, oh yeah, we have enough House polling, right? Let's really get some Senate data. So yeah, my interest waxes and wanes with my
how much time you're spending on that model.
Yeah. But the governor's races are pretty interesting in a couple of respects. One is that individually, the races, for example, in Florida and Georgia, where you have African-American Democratic candidates running, are interesting. The Midwest is interesting, where you have a big Democratic comeback. It looks like maybe even Scott Walker will lose. It looks like he's actually trailing a bit in our polling average. Mm-hmm. So there's a local level. Nationally, they're interesting in the sense that they're like a fairly clean test of whether it's a blue wave election or not, right? With the acknowledgement that partisanship is less of a factor in governor's race. We'll talk about that later. There's no gerrymandering in governorships, right? You win a state. There's no electoral college, right? There's no National Council of Governors. There probably is the National Governors Association, but no one really cares about the National Governors Association, right? So are you winning the big high population and or swing states in races for governor is a fairly pure test of what the political environment is.
And there's a bunch of key swing states that have gubernatorial elections this fall. So before we go any further into that, what are the top line numbers? What you just said kind of leads us into the way that the model actually portrays who's ahead in the race for American governorships, I guess maybe that's how you want to describe it.
The top line numbers are 194 million and 135 million.
Mind blown. And what do those numbers mean?
They represent, on average, how many people we expect Democrats to control in the states where they'll have governorships.
Like how many Americans will be represented by a Democratic governor?
Controlled by.
Yeah, okay. That's a little weird way to put it. Fair enough. And so that's almost 200 million on one hand. How many under Republicans?
194 to 135. It's a little different if you're used to seeing numbers like electoral college numbers. We got numbers in the millions, yo. So about 60% of the population we project, and there is uncertainty in these projections like every other projection that we publish. But the average projection is about 60% of the population would be Democrat-controlled.
And so how did we decide to express the governor's races in this way? I mean, you could have put it in terms of votes, I guess.
Can we swear on the podcast?
Go ahead, do it.
Because it's stupid to treat each state as equally important.
What about just votes? You could say how many votes you projected Democratic governors to get versus Republican governors.
You could do that. I mean, I guess their model probably calculates a popular vote forecast, but but governorships are winner take all. Right? Mm-hmm. If you lose Ohio by 1 point and you're Republicans, you don't kind of halfway govern Ohio.
So then, in a way, it can be gerrymandered. Well, a little bit,
it
right?
Can be gerrymandered. No, it's still
in the sense,
Galen is
right? It's not gerrymandering. It's not gerrymandering. It's the same aspect to the electoral college, right?
Yeah, it's winner take all. But state lines aren't Well, you can argue. You can get into arguments about like whether the Dakotas were a gerrymander. There should probably just be one Dakota.
I feel like North and South, or maybe just North Dakota, gets a lot of crap on this podcast. Usually from Micah, though.
South Dakota is quite a bit more interesting. You got like the Black Hills, you got Mount Rushmore. South Dakota is a pretty good state.
North Dakota, on the other hand, is that what you're implying? Okay. let's get into the meat of things, some individual races, maybe going in order from closest according to our model. And there are a lot of tight races, it looks like. The closest race is Georgia, followed by Nevada, then Ohio, Wisconsin, Kansas, Florida. Some really key states there. First, let's talk about Georgia.
You have Stacey Abrams, who is trying to become one of the first African Americans elected. Actually, I think she and Andrew Gillum are trying to become the first African American governors in the South since Douglas Wilder was elected, and the first ever in Georgia and Florida,
when was
respectively.
When was
I think
Douglas
he won
Wilder elected?
in 89.
Mm-hmm.
Virginia has odd-numbered years election, so 89 or 91. I think 89, probably. She is down by about a point in our forecasts, which means it's a toss-up, although if you had to pick, you would have, say, Kemp has the slightest edge. That's a state where there are, I hate to use the term controversy, right? But there have been efforts by Georgia Republicans to make it harder for people not to register, but to say that you have to have exact name matches or else your registration goes in some purgatory territory. But it's a case where it's like close enough that things like turnout will matter, but even attempts to curb turnout could matter too in Georgia. And remember, Georgia's a state where it's not very elastic, by which we mean you tend to have either...
It's all turnout.
Yeah, so you have either black voters and or liberals in Atlanta and or college students, right, who are in a typical year about 46 or 47% of the electorate. Then you have conservative whites who are 53% of the electorate. And so for Democrats, it's a state where every vote counts. It's not a place where you'd expect to see Abrams win by 6, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe she can win by 1 or 2. And right now she's behind by 1, which is close enough to a toss-up. That's the way to think about it. But very, very close race.
Is it notable that the race is that close in Georgia? We don't really think of Georgia as a purple state, do we?
Well, Georgia is a bit like the equivalent of New Jersey for Republicans, where New Jersey, including this year to some extent with Menendez, right, is often a state that winds up teasing Republicans at polls pretty close till the end, and then you look up on election night, and this race that was shown as a 6-point race winds up being a 13-point race. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there have been a lot of teases for Democrats in Georgia in a lot of races for a long time. Typically you get some indication where the Republican pulls ahead toward the end, at least, and I'm not sure that's happened here. It's kind of been polling as a 1-point race in one direction or another all along. And, just one piece of framing that people forget is turnout midterm elections is low to begin with. So if you can turn out your voters at a disproportionate rate compared to how they vote normally in midterms, then that can have a big effect. So Abram is probably hoping for a differential turnout where you have big turnout from blacks and liberals, obviously, and conservatives aren't as motivated by Kemp, but yeah.
So the other races that are in the toss-up camp are Ohio and Nevada. Ohio is interesting, right? Because we project Sherrod Brown doing pretty well there. I mean, not even really being endangered there. What are the aspects going into this Ohio race? I mean,
Ohio, you have two fairly conventional longtime candidates, Mike DeWine and Richard Cordray. And, it's a little bit of an exception where all the other industrial Midwestern states, so Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, incumbent, looks like he's going to cruise to re-election. Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, the Democrat, looks like she's going to cruise to a fairly comfortable victory. Tim Walz, Democrat, Minnesota, we rate that as likely Democrat. Iowa, we have the Democrat a little bit ahead to upset the Republican incumbent, for example. Illinois, right?
We'll talk about Wisconsin in a moment. Yeah.
Ohio, though, is polling as more of a pure toss-up. I mean, Ohio is a little bit red-tinged. Way to vote for Trump by 8 or 9 points or something in 2016. So it wouldn't be surprising if Republicans did a little better there than, say, in Wisconsin, which is more truly purple.
And we do have Wisconsin as lean Democratic. And, obviously, this will be Scott Walker's 4th election since taking the governor's seat.
He runs for a lot of things and wins things.
And wins recall elections.
There are 2 challenges in Wisconsin. One is that you actually have big spreads in the polls, where I think one poll has Democrat Evers up 10, and one poll has Evers, excuse me. Oh, you are from Wisconsin.
Well, I'm not from Wisconsin, but I've done my time there.
Tony Beaver.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, Tony Evers.
Mm-hmm.
So the polls are all over the place. The other thing is that usually incumbents win re-election, not breaking any news here, especially in purple states. And so the fundamentals part of our model says, okay, if it's close, then maybe Walker pulls it out. He's won a lot of close elections before. Despite that, it has Evers as a 62% favorite, but that will be a closely watched race, I think.
So what I found interesting in looking at this is there are a bunch of races where the projection is not dramatically different, but I mean significantly different between the Senate and the governor's race. Some examples are, Arizona. Florida seems to be leaning more for the Democrat Andrew Gillum in the gubernatorial race than in the Senate race, for example. Another example was Ohio. I mean, so do we just expect that between the Senate and the governor's race, people split their tickets pretty often?
I haven't looked at that specifically. Maybe I should. I mean, I'd say...
And even like Tammy Baldwin, right? She's not even really endangered, whereas the governor's race in Wisconsin is pretty tight.
In Wisconsin, you have a Republican... The dynamics around Tammy Baldwin and Scott Walker are pretty different, and there are also like a lot of swing voters in Wisconsin, right? So you have, incumbents from opposite parties. Walker is a real lightning rod for attention. Baldwin tends to keep her head down a little bit more. In Florida, I mean, the Gillum polls and Bill Nelson's polls have tracked each other pretty well, except it seems like there are just a few voters who are Gillum/Rick Scott voters, and that's been consistent enough in the polls. I'm not sure who those are, but one theory is that they're Hispanic voters. That Rick Scott, by virtue of how he's handled hurricanes, for example, has kind of slowly but surely built up a little bit of a trust with some Hispanic voters in Florida, whereas Bill Nelson may be seen as out of touch. And so you do have a few people. It doesn't have to be a lot, right? But, but that's why Gillum seems to be 3 points ahead, whereas Nelson is, if that, 1 point ahead.
We've covered some of the close races here, but if listeners want to go check out more of the individual races, they should certainly do that. You can go to 538.com and play with the model for yourself. But speaking in more broad terms, again, how can we place this forecast in history? Would Democratic governors representing 60% of the United States be significant historically? I guess, after 2010, right, you had Republican governors sweep.
So one of the things that happens when you get into an election crunch, right, is that there are all types of logical things that you think you would have researched before going on your own podcast, which you haven't, right? So I don't know how to put that 60-40 spread in context.
Okay,
you obviously had really big, kind of very strong period for GOP governors in the early and mid 2010s, the decade that we're still in. Although, they never took over the governorships of New York, and once Schwarzenegger lost California, for example. So I think they would have been pretty well ahead, but yeah, we should have researched that.
Okay, we will look that up and we'll get back to you, Model Talk listeners.
But my hunch is that governorships, there are conflicting trends here. So the conflicting trends are, on the one hand, they're a little bit more localized, even as compared to House races, which are more localized than presidential races. So you can have things that are more idiosyncratic. On the other hand, partisanship is a much less powerful force in governors, which makes them swingier. Let's say you have a state that ordinarily votes Republican for president by 30 points. In a governor's race, you would only expect that race to favor them by about a third as much, so a 10-point advantage, for example. What that means is that a strong candidate can overcome partisanship much more often, and also that, national tides can overcome a partisan lean much more often in a governor's race than in a House and a Senate race, where still in the majority of House districts, still in 4/5 of the House districts, it doesn't matter how much of a blue wave there is or isn't, they're just always going to vote the same way no matter what.
Do we know why that is? My guess would be that you focus on a governor's policy more than you focus on their partisanship, whereas a House representative is kind of an abstract thing. You can be a little more ideological. Is that at all the reason, or is there another reason?
It's an interesting question, right? And one that, I think you don't have to calibrate to the national party as much, right? You're like, hey, I can be a Maryland type of Republican governor if I'm Larry Hogan, where I'm openly critical of Trump because I don't have to vote in Congress, right? And I don't really rely on national Republican committees to raise money, right? I can be openly liberal on social issues and be a bit more fiscally conservative, right? You tend not to have candidates like that get nominated in races that are nationalized, and also voters might say, you know what, actually I agree with Hogan, but I don't trust him to actually vote that way in the Senate when there is peer pressure from Mitch McConnell, so I'm happy to have him as my governor, but if he runs for Senate, it's a whole different story. Honestly, voters are right to say, I think this person's going to vote along party lines in the Senate, no matter how much moderate clothing they drape themselves in. That's empirically what happens, right?
Right.
Empirically, you really do have some moderate Republican governors who might have very Democratic state legislatures who actually do govern like moderates, and so voters are right to trust that promise.
The House and Senate model are the same. Are there any key differences in the governor's model that we should know about?
There are some minor things. For example, for Senate incumbents and House incumbents, we use their voting record as a way to help forecast the fundamentals. If you break from party ranks for more often, then you tend to do better, actually, if you're Joe Manchin or someone, for example. That data isn't really available in a convenient form for governors, so we can't use that bit of data. But it's more like not how the model is constructed, which is like 90-ish% the same, as like what things are more or less important, right? So again, the big one being that like state level partisanship is a lot less important in governor's races. People should not be surprised that in Massachusetts and Maryland in particular, that Republicans are way ahead. Our fundamentals model says that that's what should happen because they're popular incumbents who have really, really outraised their opponents. And the fact that they're Republicans is a minor disadvantage, but not a major one like it would be in a race for Senate, for example.
Is uncertainty any different in the governor's model, or the factors of uncertainty? I mean, people who go to the forecast will see that at the very top, we don't have an uncertainty band that shows where 80% of the elections might fall, for example. I mean, is there less uncertainty?
Not really. I mean, there is, but like I don't think people are really that, maybe I'm wrong, right? I mean, this whole notion of like presenting like a population count is fairly novel.
Mm-hmm.
I think we felt like maybe people weren't that interested in the confidence interval around that fairly novel calculation anyway.
Fair enough.
Maybe we're wrong. Give us feedback. Like if there are things you really want to see that you're not seeing the governor's forecast, then I will nudge people.
And I
don't have a lot of influence anymore, right? Because like people are so busy, even I can't pull the boss card.
And I should also say that you do see a confidence interval if you scroll down to look at the individual races.
You do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We're going to take some questions from listeners, but before we do that, should we check in on the House forecast? I know that there's quite a bit going on there with new fundraising numbers that came in, and maybe we will touch on that in another podcast very soon, because that could be a whole conversation in itself. But is there anything you want to say?
It could be, couldn't it?
It could be. Is there anything that you want to say before we move on to listener questions about the House forecast?
The House has ticked back up to Democrats. It's kind of bounced around between about 80 and 85%, depending on when you look, which is close to the high it was at in early mid-September. That's partly because Democrats, we just had Q3 fundraising numbers roll into our model. Those were very good for Democrats. They have outraised Republicans in about 90% of competitive races, which is kind of unprecedented, including lots of races where Republicans are the incumbent or Republicans are favored. And so one big concern our model has for Republicans is like, we currently show 50 likely Republican seats, which are places where Republicans have between a 75% chance and a 95% chance of winning. So those are places where you would bet on the Republican, confidently bet on the Republican at even odds, right? Or even at 2-1. But they're not going to win all 50 of those in all probability. Even if the polls are about right overall, there will be some quirky districts where a Republican incumbent is underprepared for a Democratic challenger, where the demographics have changed more than people anticipate. That's a big liability to have all those lean Republican seats or unlikely Republican seats where your opponent has outraised you and is going to have like a strong finishing kick. So that's one reason why our model has become more optimistic for Democrats, is the fundraising numbers. But also the generic ballot has improved a tick or so for Democrats. It's back to around an 8.5 point lead versus having been down to 7.5. It seems like pretty minor things, but that's what can send the forecast from 75% to 80%, which is not a huge shift. The House never really shifted that much after Kavanaugh anyway, right? So it didn't shift down that much, and it shifts back up the kind of amount that it lost.
And people that are keeping track will notice that the light forecast has Democrats at around 76% or 3 and 4 chance. And that's because there could be several reasons, but in part, the fundraising numbers go into the fundamentals that are only factored into the classic version.
And deluxe, yeah. So light is pure polls. It also accounts for more uncertainty, so it makes the spread a bit wider. That's at around 75-ish%, whereas classic is 84% as I write this. Well, I understand new polls, maybe it'll be 82% or 85 by the time you read this. But
by the time you read this, but you probably will never read this. But by the time you listen,
actually there are services now that write out words from podcasts.
Oh, yeah?
In text. But yeah, so that spread, they had almost totally converged, and that spread opened back up a little bit because of the fundraising numbers. So if you don't trust, but the thing is, like, we're not like banking that much on this, or our model isn't. If you want to use a pure polling version, okay, is your life going to be radically altered if the chances are 76% versus 83%? You know, I would hope not. They're still in the same zone where Democrats are. It's a long way from a toss-up. It's also a long way from being certain. So I don't think it kind of changes the fundamental characterization of the races so much. But like, it does like yield some kind of uncertainty that maybe even is larger than what the model implies, in the sense that, so let's say you ignore fundraising for a moment. I would say that all the data lines up in a way that tells a very consistent story, right? You have the generic ballot showing Democrats up 8, maybe 8.5. Based on historical trends in midterms, you'd expect them to win by 7 or 8, given Trump's approval rating. The district polls seem to line up in a way that would suggest maybe 7 or 8 or 9 points, right? So all the data is really well behaved, except the fundraising numbers are like this crazy outlier that like no one's ever seen anything like this before, right? And it wasn't like this had been building for Democrats as advantage in small donor fundraising over time, right? In 2016, it was about 50-50 if you add up all the House races who raised the most money. It was like, actually, I think a tiny bit against Democrats in 2014, which is a good GOP year, right? All of a sudden, they like lead 2-1 in fundraising in a year when they don't have very many incumbents. Usually incumbents do a better job of fundraising. It's like one of the kind of bigger outliers I've seen in the data. How our model handles it is it says, okay, well, you know, it's one of several factors, so just kind of average it in, which maybe isn't a bad strategy, right? You shouldn't ignore it. You're not supposed to, when you have an outlier anything, say, oh, let me just ignore that data, right? That's not actually good technique.
All right. Well, as I said, we could spend a whole separate podcast on fundraising, and I will mention, we don't have time to get to it, but I will mention that according to the Senate forecast, Democrats have a 1 in 5 chance of winning a majority there, and Republicans have a 4 in 5 chance of keeping it. And let's take some listener questions. But before we do that, we have a word from this episode's sponsor, WeWork. Whether you're a team of 2 or 200, at WeWork, space matters. From single-desk solutions and innovative amenities to flexible private offices designed to grow along with your headcount, WeWork gives your business the space you need to connect, focus, build, and succeed. WeWork now has 280 locations across more than 70 cities in 24 countries around the world, making it the perfect partner for your next satellite office, regional headquarters, or remote employees. Your team members spend over a third of their lives in your office space. Wow, I didn't realize I spent that much time here. So why not make it exceptional? Everything from IT and maintenance to security, cleaning, wellness programming, and cold brew on tap is handled by WeWork. WeWork provides the intentional design, infectious energy, and outstanding service your team needs in order to just show up and do what they do best. Visit WeWork.com to find a location near you today. Nate, speaking of that winter office, it's starting to get a bit nippy out there, so we should probably look into that. I think we settled on Rio, was it?
I think we did decide on Rio, right? Or Hawaii.
Or Hawaii, yeah. We'll have to get Stephanie on board. Okay, we are back, and it is time for listener questions. But actually, the first thing on the docket is more of a listener comment. Eliza, I don't know how you pronounce her name. She says, the word that you want is fortnightly. A fortnight has always meant 14 days. So fortnightly is an occurrence that happens once every 2 weeks. She says, I know it's an old-fashioned and forgotten word, but I challenge you to bring it back into common lexicon.
A great goddamn word. I'm a fortnightly.
So this is in response to last week, us having a conversation about whether this podcast happens bi-weekly or semi-weekly. The answer is it happened fortnightly, but now it's happening every week because we're closing in on Election Day. But thank you, Eliza. Isaac asks, right now, the model shows Democrats with an 85% chance, I think he sent this yesterday when that was the case, to take the House. And that all they need to do is win every race that leans Democrat and 2 or 3 toss-ups. But he says, I remember that a couple weeks ago when Democrats were hovering at 80%, the model showed that they could win the House with only races that leaned Democrat, meaning they don't need any toss-ups to win. So he asks, does this mean that the recent shift upward in Democrats' chances has come from weakening likely and lean Republican districts rather than improved Democrat odds in races that were already toss-ups or so on?
So you right now have 216 races that are either lean D, likely D, or solid D, which is 3 short of what they'd need, so they haven't quite hit that threshold again. So a lot of the recent gains have come from this likely Republican category expanding, where you've either had polling data or fundraising data, one of those two things, to suggest that maybe a few more races are in play than people assumed were in play. So in some ways, that's I think part of the debate that we're getting into with other forecasters, to the extent there is one. It's not really been that heated this year, I would say.
We're trying to stoke that flame, but
yeah.
It's not happening as much this year.
We think the likely Republican category is pretty important, where you have 50 opportunities for something to go right. And if it goes right in 10 or 15% of those, then all of a sudden you've gained 5 to 7 more seats, and your House math is a lot more robust.
So, Isaac, your analysis is correct that the improvement for Democrats is happening in the lean and likely Republican category. On to the next question. Hillary asks, and this actually gets at something that you brought up earlier, do the models account for voter suppression? And if so, how? And she talks about reading the AP report on what's happening in Georgia surrounding checking voter registration for exact matches. I assume that it's not in the model, but...
We don't. I mean, in theory, pollsters should try to account for that.
How would they account for that?
You could ask, are you registered to vote? Have you verified that, with the state of Georgia that you're currently registered? You could ask something like that, increase the threshold. The thing about voter suppression efforts in the short run is that voter suppression efforts, if they're publicized, can have the effect of boosting voter awareness, and therefore you have people who are targeted by voter suppression efforts who become more diligent about voting and checking their status. So a lot of the political science work in the short run says that it's not clear how much effect, if any, it has. The cumulative effect, though, in the long run, I think obviously can be pretty significant, where what becomes the new normal. I mean, things like mail voting. One reason why California and Oregon and Washington have become really blue is because you can vote by mail there. Not the only reason, but that definitely increases turnout when you have that option. It seems like having early voting increases turnout, and so kind of the cumulative effect might be pretty large, right? But Georgia, the governor's race there is so close that that might be literally a case where it might matter, but it could matter in either direction, right? It could be that okay, now black voters who do not traditionally vote in high levels of midterms are these Republicans, I'm going to make sure that I turn out and vote. A lot of swearing in this for a model talk, especially. So you got to be a little careful about assuming that which direction the way it goes in the short run.
But the short answer for you, Hillary, is that it is not in the model. And I think we're planning on talking a little bit more about voting laws with some other folks from 538 in an episode coming up soon. So definitely tune back in. Jason asks, what are some of the races in which you think your models are missing something noteworthy, where you trust your model the least? So is there a place where you say, I don't know about that model?
I mean, to some extent, any race where you have divergent outcomes, this West Virginia 3rd District where you have Richard Ojeda, I guess is how he says it, who is this Democrat, in a district that went for Trump by 50 points, but he's very military guy, Ojeda, West Virginia, so... Apparently,
Claire was saying that he's never voted for a Democrat for president, so he's Democrat-ish.
And he's 3 points down in the polls. Our model says that, we don't really trust the polls here. We're only giving him about a 10, 15% chance of winning. Maybe I'd bet on him. I don't know, right? But look, in general, the sources of uncertainty the model is supposed to account for. I think the handling of candidates with scandals can be interesting in that it kind of uses a one-size-fits-all metric for scandals. So the Chris Collins race in New York 27, our fundamentals model says that actually it has it kind of close, so I take that back, because the Democrat raised a lot more money last cycle than Collins did. But that's a case where it would say, it's a scandal, but it's such a Republican district that it's not quite enough to get Nate McMurray, who sounds like a kicker for the Buffalo Bills or something, over the top. But being indicted by the FBI for insider trading, dropping out, and then realizing you can't actually really drop out, right? That's probably a bigger impact than an ordinary scandal, right? So I can buy...
So every single scandal takes off the same amount of points from your fundamentals.
Yeah, and that seems like pretty big scandal, plus the fact that he's not kind of actively campaigning there.
But is that
anymore.
being picked up in the polls now? Or people aren't really polling that
It is, right? But like our model's a bit more skeptical than, like that's a case where it's not a huge difference, actually. The light version of our forecast, which is polls, only has McMurray, the Democrat, with a 35% chance. Classic, which counts for fundamentals, has a 28% chance. Maybe it's closer to 35. That's not a big gap, right?
So we're going to move on to rapid fire pretty soon. But before we do, we have a question from Paul. He says, how do pollsters define likely voters? Is it based on simply asking the polled individual? Is there some gradient response, like on a scale from 1 to 10? Or is it based off of, looking at an individual's historical voting record? How do you define likely voters?
How do I define likely voters? I define
how are you going to...
How would opposed to... So there are a whole wide range. I was going to say banquet.
A bouquet.
A bouquet or banquet.
A constellation.
I get those confused. A whole constellation of approaches.
Mm-hmm.
The simplest of which is just to say, ask people, are you going to vote? And if they say they're certainly going to vote or almost certainly going to vote, you call them likely voters, right? That's one approach. A more complicated approach is to ask them a bunch of questions about, like, do you know where your polling place is? Did you vote last time, right?
Do you know who's running?
Have you been paying attention to the campaign?
Yeah.
And then so you generate a score based on how people answer those questions. And then you say, okay, we're going to have an overall target for turnout. Let's say it's, 55% of registered voters. And then the 55% of people who do best on that, on that little mini quiz we gave them about how much they know about voting are called likely voters. If I just describe that seems like kind of a stupid cockamamie method to do it. And yet, that was like the standard of the industry for many years, and many pollsters still apply something like that. A third approach, which I think is the best approach, although it's not that often used, although I think Upshot Siena is doing something like this, is to say, okay, we're going to measure likely voters probabilistically. Your propensity, you're telling us how likely you are to vote, is a big factor, but not the only factor. We'll also weigh past voting history. I don't know if they weigh demographics or not. And that's better to me, right? Because not 100% of likely voters will vote, not 100% of unlikely voters won't vote, and so it should be probabilistic. If you're not doing a probabilistic way, then there's actually no intellectually coherent defense of that. It's just worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier, but it's worse.
Mm-hmm.
And yet almost all polls. But anyway, this is a little mini diatribe about my dislike of non-probabilistic likely voter models, but there are a lot of different ways to do it.
All right, now it is time for the rapid fire segment of listener questions. We're going to try to keep the answers as short as possible. First up, Michael asks, does the model take primary turnout into account?
Nope.
We got a lot of these kind of, does the model consider X thing? We'll just run through them real fast. A lot of people asked, does the model look at states' early mail-in ballot return numbers? I know the answer to this one because everybody asked it in 2016. The answer is definitely no.
Nope.
Allie asks, does the classic model take the stock market into account?
Nope.
Timothy asks, I was curious about how the Senate and House models account for third-party candidates, particularly in close races where the third-party vote could potentially shift outcomes, such as in North Carolina 9.
Nope.
Okay.
We have a threshold where what we call viable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that basically means if the third-party candidate is almost always being included in polls, we will treat them as viable. And, another kind of general good heuristic is if the third-party candidate is polling in some polls, but not just one poll, in double digits, that's a pretty good threshold for viability where they can be a factor in the race. I'm skeptical that when a candidate's at 4 or 5% in a House race, I'm skeptical that that will necessarily show up on election day, and or that if it does, the poll is a particularly good indication of that. A third-party vote is a wasted vote in the House. Sometimes third-party voters can be undecideds who will either pick one of the major party candidates or not vote by election day. And so that viability threshold of 10%, there aren't really any House races where that's a factor.
All right. Lane asks, does the model take into account the possible effects of ranked choice voting in Maine's
Nope.
Senate and House seats? House
Nope.
races? Nope, it doesn't.
Nope.
Okay. Fair enough.
I actually did some work on how you would account for that. It's not going to make a big enough difference.
Long
in
story
these
short,
races.
It was a lot of work.
Sure.
It's not going to make a big difference. Next question in the rapid fire round. Aaron asks, how much of a difference does it make in an election whether or not you have a well-run campaign? Nope.
Pass. Not nope. Look, so candidates matter a lot, right? One way to kind of look at this is like, if you just looked at district partisanship and so forth, how much variation would there be based on the candidates? The answer would be a lot, right? But how much of that has to do with like the political environment that produces those candidates versus like how reliable other indicators are versus how well they run their campaigns is a little bit hard to say. The irony is like people pay so much more attention to like the nuts and bolts of the presidential campaign. The presidential campaign is the one thing where you might say the campaigns don't matter that much, right? It's so media driven and so people are so partisan, right? That in presidential campaigns, like running a campaign doesn't really matter that much. But again, good candidate versus good campaign is a hard distinction to parse.
All right, Nate, I think we've reached our end. This was a long model talk.
You think I didn't notice? I haven't had lunch yet.
We had a lot to say
Galen?
today. Well, now that we have 3 forecasts, there's so much to cover. Anyway.
We model, you talk, no big whoop. Wait, what? Never mind.
What?
You know, like the old Coffee Talk Saturday Night Live, right?
Coffee talk?
Coffee Talk?
Coffee talk?
Mortal Talk?
I think it's just muzzle tough. So what are you going to do with all of your time now that you don't have any more forecasts?
We have a 4th model coming out, an election night.
Election night. Oh, goodness.
But I will say one cool thing is, so we now actually have collected data from ABC on for the past 3 or 4 elections, what the vote data that they received looked like in real time and when they made calls, right? And so, a lot of problems with election night models, and some of them do great, some of them do not so great. It's kind of a high-risk enterprise, is that, it's quite assumption-driven, and you only have, one chance to test your assumptions. That's election day. So we now have data on, let's say you had a forecast that initially was lean Republican, but 80% of the vote is in, and the state leans Democratic by 5 points, right? We now have an answer to, how much would you adjust the forecast? And so that's kind of cool.
So get ready, guys. You should definitely be focused on our election night forecast is basically what Nate's saying. All right, Nate, thank you.
Thank you, Galen.
I'm Galen Druk. Tony Chow is in the control room. We'll be recording another model talk again soon. In fact, in just 1 week. So send us your questions either on Twitter or at podcasts@538.com. I know we couldn't fit in any questions about the governor's model today because it just launched, but we look forward to seeing some of those questions. Also, go rate us on Apple Podcasts or tell your friends about the show. That's it from us, and we will see you soon.